In December 2010, Thomas Grant, a civil engineer, accompanied his wife, Rachel, to her company's annual Christmas party in downtown Chicago. Thomas was more than happy to support her, especially since Rachel had recently become a top financial advisor at a prestigious investment firm. She was ambitious, sharp, and excelled in her work. Though Thomas enjoyed his career, his work was never the focus of their social conversations, which often revolved around Rachel's industry insights and the excitement of finance. At the party, Thomas found himself observing as Rachel's colleagues circled her, eager to discuss the latest market trends. Her boss, Alan Parker, a well-groomed executive with an eye for profitable ventures, seemed particularly invested in Rachel's opinions. Alongside him stood Jordan Wexler, another partner known for his risk-taking, whose eyes practically sparkled as he discussed the housing market and a new wave of real estate-backed securities. "Rachel, I'm telling you, these real estate-backed loans are going to deliver massive returns," Alan insisted, grinning. "Our clients are eager for high yields, and the market is ripe for the picking." Rachel laughed lightly, but her response took a more serious turn. "I'd love the returns, but my gut says it's risky, too good to be true. I wouldn't recommend these to any client I'm not prepared to back with my own money," she said. Alan and Jordan exchanged glances, seemingly surprised. Rachel's instincts about market trends were rarely wrong. Thomas watched, sensing her reluctance about the topic. Later, after the party ended and they returned home, he brought it up. "So, what's the deal with those real estate loans?" he asked as they settled on the couch. Rachel sighed, her brow furrowed. "They're mortgage-backed securities," she explained. "They're extremely profitable in the short term, but I see dangerous signs. The market is showing early symptoms of a bubble, and I think the whole thing could come crashing down." "Do you think it would affect us?" Thomas asked, feeling a slight unease. Rachel looked him in the eye, her expression somber. "If it collapses, it'll hit everywhere: real estate, construction, investment firms. People will lose jobs. I'm actually thinking of stepping back from this type of investment and looking into more secure options. You should think about it too." Thomas, trusting her judgment, nodded. He was a civil engineer overseeing infrastructure projects, and if a real estate crisis did erupt, his industry could be in jeopardy too. Following Rachel's advice, he dusted off his resume and began sending it out, preparing for a potential career pivot just in case. Over the next few months, things seemed stable enough, though Thomas's job applications yielded no responses. The construction industry was slowing down subtly, and whispers of financial instability started floating around. By October, things had taken a sharp return. Thomas received a call from a recruiter offering a position with a company in Denver, Colorado. It was a solid role managing construction projects for municipal buildings. Though the pay was slightly lower, he was told the position could grow and offer stability in uncertain times. He immediately shared the news with Rachel. After dinner that night, Rachel responded thoughtfully. "Denver? It's a big move, but with everything happening in the market, it might be the right choice. If we're going to make a change, we should do it while things are relatively calm." With Rachel's encouragement, Thomas accepted the job. They sold their apartment in Chicago and rented a cozy 2-bedroom apartment in Denver, where Rachel transitioned to a remote advisor role for her firm's high-net-worth clients. In the first few months, their life in Denver was calm and promising. The job suited Thomas, who managed to establish a good reputation in his new role, and Rachel's clientele continued to grow as she gained new business through referrals. For the first time in years, Thomas felt secure and at ease, and he often thought about how wise Rachel had been to steer them away from the potentially devastating collapse in Chicago's real estate market. By 2011, they had saved enough to purchase a modest house in an up-and-coming neighborhood near the edge of Denver. It wasn't extravagant, but it was spacious and peaceful, a place they could see themselves settling in. Rachel seemed happier than ever. Their lives, plans, and dreams all felt perfectly aligned. They discussed having kids, making travel plans, and even joked about the idea of early retirement if their investments grew. Then, in late 2012, Rachel introduced Thomas to someone she described as an investment visionary, Evan Marks. They met over dinner, and Thomas couldn't help but notice that Evan was charismatic, confident, and a bit too familiar with Rachel. Though she brushed off his concerns, Thomas felt a slight undercurrent of tension. Evan brought up an opportunity in commercial real estate that he was very keen on, a game changer, he said, that could triple their money in a few short years. His proposal centered around purchasing land rights for oil drilling in areas expected to undergo major development. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Isn't that risky? I mean, what if oil prices fall? Absolutely, Evan replied smoothly, but the potential upside is massive. We'd be acquiring land rights, not the actual land. If developers want to tap the resources later, they'll have to come to us. Rachel's told me about your skills, Tom. You must know how much opportunity there is here. Thomas noticed Rachel watching him closely, as though gauging his reaction. Though he trusted her, something about Evan's proposal made him uncomfortable. Still, he respected Rachel's business acumen, and since she seemed interested, he decided to support her. Evan explained that they'd need to invest a considerable amount to secure the land rights, around $250,000 from each of them. To sweeten the deal, Evan promised he'd match their investment with his own funds. Rachel was visibly excited, reminding Thomas how this could fast-track their plans for starting a family and even allow them to retire earlier than expected. Though skeptical, Thomas agreed. Rachel and Evan prepared a partnership agreement, and she asked him to sign several documents. Caught up in the excitement of potential gains, he signed without much thought. As weeks turned into months, Evan's presence grew in their lives, though mostly through phone calls and emails. Rachel seemed committed to the project, working late and frequently meeting Evan to discuss their plans. Thomas, tied up with his own work and travel for projects in rural areas, began to feel a slight sense of distance creeping into his relationship with Rachel. She was quieter on the weekends, often distracted, and seemed more eager to get back to her work than to spend time with him. He brushed it off as stress, convincing himself that the sacrifices would be worth it when their venture finally bore fruit. However, the dynamic between them shifted further over the next year. Rachel's once enthusiastic affection dulled to distant politeness. When Thomas asked her if everything was okay, she brushed him off, claiming she was tired. He grew increasingly uneasy, especially as she seemed more and more engaged with her work and distant with him. When he brought it up once more, her answer left him cold. "You're always gone for work, and this venture means a lot to me, Thomas. It's something real, something promising for our future." Her words echoed in his mind as he drove off to his next project site in Colorado Springs. The hollow feeling in his chest was hard to shake. By early 2013, Thomas was increasingly worried about Rachel's growing distance. Each time he tried to connect with her, it felt like she was slipping further away. Their once shared dreams and plans for a family seemed to evaporate. He couldn't help but wonder if it had anything to do with Evan's constant presence in their lives. Yet each time he asked about him, Rachel downplayed their interactions, calling Evan merely a business partner. A few weeks later, after wrapping up a particularly stressful project, Thomas returned home unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. He wanted to surprise Rachel, perhaps rekindle their spark. Instead, as he pulled into their driveway, he was surprised to see a sleek black BMW parked outside, a car he recognized as Evan's. Thomas walked quietly toward the front door, heart pounding, hoping he was wrong about what he suspected. Inside, he heard muffled voices and faint laughter. He froze, straining to catch snippets of their conversation. "Can't wait much longer, Rach. We have to move forward," Evan's voice said, soft but insistent. I know, but we can't rush this. He trusts me completely, Evan," Rachel replied, her tone strangely tense. Thomas's stomach twisted. There was a darkness to their conversation that he couldn't ignore. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob, but he couldn't bring himself to go in. Instead, he backed away slowly, slipping into the shadows near their garage. He waited until Evan left, watching as his car disappeared into the night, before finally stepping inside. When Rachel heard him enter, she looked up with a surprised smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Tom, you're back early." "Yeah, project wrapped up faster than expected," he replied, forcing a smile. They shared a tense meal, neither of them addressing the silence that had come between them. Thomas' mind raced, replaying fragments of their conversation, trying to convince himself that he was reading too much into it. But that night, he lay awake, haunted by the suspicion that Rachel's loyalty might not be as steadfast as he once thought. A few days later, Thomas came up with a plan to either confirm or dispel his growing doubts. He decided to return home early from his next project without telling Rachel. If there was something going on, he'd catch her off guard. He rented a car and drove back to Denver on a Tuesday afternoon, his pulse racing as he parked a short distance away from the house. As he neared their home, he felt a strange combination of dread and determination. When he got to their driveway, he immediately noticed the BMW again. Silently, he crept around to the side of the house and crouched by a window, peering in through a gap in the curtains. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Rachel and Evan were sitting close together, their faces inches apart, laughing in a way that sent an icy chill down his spine. Though they weren't being physically intimate, the familiarity and intensity between them spoke volumes. 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind, each darker than the last. How long had this been going on? What had she told him about their lives, their finances, their dreams? Was this business venture nothing more than a cover for their betrayal? He stepped back, his jaw clenched, struggling to keep himself from storming in. Instead, he returned to his car and drove around aimlessly, trying to process everything he'd seen and heard. When he finally returned home later that night, Rachel was already asleep. But as he lay beside her, the space between them felt like an ocean. Days passed, each one a test of his patience and restraint. Thomas' once happy home felt like a stranger's house. He began to keep a close eye on Rachel, noting the times she'd go out for work meetings or receive calls late at night. When she would step outside to speak in hushed tones, his suspicions only deepened. His trust in her, once so solid, had shattered. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Thomas hired a private investigator named Daniel Carrington, an old friend from college who'd moved into security and surveillance work. Though it pained him to involve someone else in his marital issues, he needed confirmation, something solid he could confront Rachel with. Daniel assured him he'd be discreet, and they set a plan in motion to monitor Rachel's activities. Over the next few weeks, Daniel provided Thomas with information that left him both devastated and angry. Rachel had been meeting with Evan regularly, and their rendezvous were far from professional. They met at upscale restaurants, secluded coffee shops, and occasionally a hotel. Though Thomas now had undeniable proof, what he couldn't understand was why Rachel hadn't just ended things with him if she was so invested in Evan. Then came another unexpected revelation. In one of their overheard conversations, Daniel reported that Rachel and Evan seemed to be discussing not only their plans to leave Thomas, but also a way to gain access to his personal assets. Their conversation was cryptic, but there was an underlying tone suggesting they were plotting something far more sinister than just an affair. One evening, when Thomas met Daniel to review the evidence, his friend handed him a recording. "Listen to this, Tom. I think you'll want to hear what they're planning," Daniel said gravely, his expression tense. Thomas sat in his car, staring out into the darkness as he played the recording. The audio was muffled, but he recognized Rachel's voice immediately. The words were chilling. "If we move forward with this, I need to know that we're safe, Evan. I don't want him suspecting anything until it's too late." "Trust me, Rachel," Evan's voice responded, sounding cold and calculating. "Once everything's in place, he'll be completely out of the picture, and we'll have what we need. All you have to do is keep him off our trail." Thomas gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the car. There was no mistaking their intentions now. They weren't just planning to leave him. They were setting him up, preparing to take everything he had, even if it meant destroying him in the process. Fighting the urge to confront Rachel right away, Thomas took a deep breath and composed himself. He knew that he couldn't risk acting impulsively. If he wanted to protect himself, he had to outsmart them. For the next week, Thomas carefully crafted a plan. He began transferring small amounts of money into a separate account Rachel didn't know about. He also changed the beneficiary details on his life insurance policy and rerouted his investments. Quietly, He backed up all of their shared financial documents onto a separate hard drive and documented everything he could about their assets in case he needed evidence later. Though every interaction with Rachel felt like a betrayal, Thomas kept up appearances, acting as though nothing had changed. He went through the motions of their life together, putting on a mask each morning and feigning normalcy, all while feeling like a stranger in his own skin. Then, one evening as he returned from work, Thomas overheard Rachel on the phone. She was in their kitchen, unaware that he'd entered the house. As he listened from the hallway, he caught fragments of her conversation. "It's almost done, Ivan. Just a little more patience, and it'll be ours." Tom's completely oblivious. He doesn't suspect a thing. The betrayal in her voice was the final straw. Thomas walked into the kitchen, meeting her gaze with a calm intensity that belied the storm inside him. "Oh, hey, I didn't hear you come in," Rachel said, her voice faltering slightly as she hung up the phone. "Yeah, I just got home," he replied evenly, forcing a tight smile. "Who was that?" "Oh, just a client," she said, her eyes shifting slightly. "Really?" he replied, raising an eyebrow. "Because it sounded like you were talking to Evan." For a split second, Rachel's face betrayed her, a flicker of panic flashing across her eyes before she composed herself. "Tom, I think you're imagining things," she said, her voice a bit too smooth, her smile brittle. Thomas simply nodded, hiding his anger. He'd made up his mind. If Rachel and Evan wanted to play this game, he'd let them think they were winning. But little did they know, he had no intention of letting them succeed in their twisted scheme. Thomas spent the next few days meticulously preparing for what he knew would be the fight of his life. Now that he was certain Rachel and Evan were not only involved in an affair but plotting against him, he knew he couldn't just confront them without a plan. He had to play this carefully, like a game of chess, predicting each of their moves before they even made them. The first step was finding out exactly what they were planning to do. With Daniel's help, he installed a discreet surveillance system in their home. Small audio recorders and cameras were hidden in the living room, kitchen, and Rachel's office. These devices would give Thomas a front row seat to every private conversation they had in his absence. He despised the invasion of privacy, but with his life and finances at stake, he saw no other way. Within days, the surveillance paid off. The conversations he captured between Rachel and Evan were nothing short of chilling. It became clear that they had a detailed strategy to frame him. They planned to falsify records, making it seem as though he had been embezzling from his own investments, which would not only ruin his career but could potentially land him in jail. This setup would leave Rachel and Evan free to take control of his accounts without interference. One evening, Thomas sat in his car and listened to a recorded conversation he captured earlier that day. Rachel's voice came through clear and determined. "So, once we transfer those funds and file the complaint, he'll be left with nothing," she said, her tone sharp. "And by the time he realizes what happened, it'll be too late to fight back." Evan laughed. "Exactly. The accounts will be closed, the investments moved. He'll have no way to prove anything. We'll get everything." Thomas clenched his jaw as he listened, the words cutting him to his core. The woman he had loved and trusted was planning his complete destruction. It wasn't enough for her to leave him. She wanted to annihilate him, erase him from his own life. A cold determination took root within him. If Rachel and Evan thought they could outsmart him, they were sorely mistaken. He would make sure they paid for every ounce of pain they'd inflicted upon him. Over the next few weeks, Thomas made several key moves. First, he opened a new bank account under a close friend's name, which would give him a safe place to transfer his assets without Rachel ever finding out. Next, he met with his lawyer, explaining the situation in vague terms and ensuring his will and other legal documents were updated. He wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him, Rachel would receive nothing. But he didn't stop there. Thomas also began researching ways to expose Rachel and Evan without implicating himself. He decided to gather all the evidence he'd collected, the recordings, financial transactions, and incriminating emails, and organize them into a digital dossier. His plan was to anonymously send this to the firm where Rachel and Evan worked, showing that they were the true masterminds behind the fraudulent scheme. One Friday night, as Thomas prepared his plan, he received a call from Daniel, who had been keeping tabs on Evan. "Tom, I just found out something interesting," Daniel said, his tone serious. Evan's been looking into life insurance policies, specifically policies with huge payouts. Thomas' blood ran cold. A life insurance policy? That could mean only one thing. They weren't just trying to ruin him financially. They were planning to get rid of him entirely. The realization hit Thomas like a freight train. Rachel and Evan didn't just want his money. They wanted him gone. His mind raced. If they succeeded, it would be almost impossible for anyone to link them to his death. Rachel, as his wife, would naturally be the primary beneficiary of any life insurance policy, and she could frame his death as an accident or a suicide if necessary. The payout would be massive, enough to set them up for life. It all made sense now. The late-night meetings, the careful plotting. They were waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But Thomas wasn't going to give them that chance. Armed with this new information, he set the final phase of his plan into motion. He decided to make himself disappear on his terms. By vanishing, he would not only escape their clutches but turn their plot against them, leaving them with nothing but questions and the suspicion of foul play hanging over their heads. The following Monday, Thomas arranged a private meeting with Daniel at a small cafe on the edge of town. They sat in a secluded corner, out of earshot of other patrons. "I need your help," Thomas said, leaning in. "I'm going to disappear, just for a while. Make it look like they succeeded. I want them to feel like they've won, and then I want to watch their world fall apart." Daniel listened intently, nodding. "We'll need to make this convincing, Tom. If you're truly going off the grid, we need to cover every track." Together, they came up with a plan. Thomas would withdraw a large sum of cash and stash it in a secure location. He'd leave traces suggesting he'd been in distress, perhaps enough for Rachel to use as proof that he'd taken his own life. Daniel would stay behind to monitor Rachel and Evan, gathering evidence and documenting any moves they made after his disappearance. Thomas also began leaving subtle signs around the house. His keys left out on the counter, notes with scribbled, cryptic messages, and even an empty bottle of sleeping pills discarded in the trash. If Rachel truly intended to set him up, she would seize on these hints, spinning them to her advantage. He wanted her to believe she had succeeded, that he had fallen for their trap and taken matters into his own hands. The day before he left, Thomas visited his lawyer one last time, finalizing a series of instructions to be carried out in his absence. Should he disappear, his assets would be transferred into a trust, inaccessible to Rachel. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief. He was ready to leave behind his old life, if only for a while, to save himself and build something new from the ashes of what Rachel and Evan had tried to destroy. As the evening approached, Thomas put on his bravest face and went home. He found Rachel in the living room, casually scrolling through her phone, her eyes flicking up briefly as he entered. "You're home late," she remarked, her voice devoid of warmth. "Yeah, long day," he replied, sinking onto the couch across from her. He forced himself to act normal, even though every fiber of his being screamed to confront her. But he knew he couldn't give her the satisfaction. They ate dinner in silence, and afterward, Thomas excused himself, saying he had work to finish. In his office, he spent a few quiet moments, letting himself say goodbye to the life he once thought he'd share with her. The next morning, Thomas left for what would be his final day at work in Denver. His departure was carefully planned. He sent an email to his boss saying he needed a leave of absence due to personal issues, something his employer would keep private. Then, he drove to a secluded cabin Daniel had helped him rent under a different name. It was far enough away that Rachel wouldn't stumble upon him, and secluded enough that no one would think to look for him there. As he drove away from Denver, his heart heavy but resolute, Thomas couldn't help but feel a strange sense of freedom. He was finally free from Rachel's betrayal and Evan's manipulation, and now it was his turn to play the game. He let them believe they'd won, but he would be watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike back. A few days passed. Daniel updated him with snippets of Rachel's reaction to his sudden disappearance. According to Daniel, she acted concerned in front of others, even filing a missing persons report with the police. But behind closed doors, she'd been seen with Evan, laughing, relaxed, almost relieved. She had taken the bait. As Thomas continued to watch and wait, he realized just how much he had sacrificed to protect himself. He had abandoned his home, his job, and the life he built in Denver. But he was also filled with a fierce determination, a resolve to see this through. Rachel and Evan's betrayal had taken everything from him, but they had underestimated his strength and his intelligence. He wouldn't just disappear without a trace. He'd leave behind a legacy that would unravel their lives piece by piece. And when the time was right, Thomas would return, not as the trusting husband they had once deceived, but as the man who had outwitted them at their own game. For the first few weeks, Thomas watched from afar as his plan unfolded. He kept his distance, carefully monitoring every move Rachel and Evan made. Daniel, his ally in the scheme, updated him daily with news about their actions. It didn't take long for Rachel and Evan to relax, thinking they'd won. They acted as if his disappearance was a done deal, as if Thomas was out of their lives for good. As Daniel reported, Rachel had swiftly moved to access Thomas's accounts, even attempting to withdraw funds from the retirement savings he had blocked her from. Frustrated but undeterred, she focused on getting Evan involved in their next phase. They seemed confident, even smug, but Thomas knew that their arrogance would be their undoing. He just needed to be patient. One afternoon, while staying hidden in the secluded cabin Daniel had helped him secure, Thomas received a video clip from Daniel. It was footage from one of the hidden cameras in the house. The recording showed Rachel and Evan having a candid conversation about their plans. "I still don't know how he could have disappeared so easily," Rachel was saying, pacing back and forth. Her face was twisted with annoyance. Evan smirked, leaning back on the couch. "Don't worry about it. It worked out perfectly. No body, no police investigation, no need to worry about anyone catching on. If anything, the mystery helps us. He's just gone." Rachel stopped, looking unsure. "I just didn't think it would be this clean. What if he comes back?" Evan shook his head. "Even if he does, we're in control now. You're his wife. Anything he tries to say, you can easily explain away. And if things get tough, we'll be ready. Trust me." Watching the video, Thomas felt a fresh surge of anger. Rachel's betrayal wasn't just cold, it was ruthless. She'd replaced years of trust and love with a calculated plan to destroy him. Yet, as much as the betrayal hurt, he also felt a sense of power. Their confidence was his advantage. They didn't know that he was one step ahead. With a deep breath, Thomas solidified his next move. The time had come to unsettle them, to show them that he hadn't just disappeared quietly. Over the next few days, he began his campaign of subtle hints and psychological maneuvers, a plan to make them doubt the success of their scheme. First, he sent a postcard from a small, remote town in Idaho to their home address, with a cryptic message. Asterisk, I know what you've done, and you can't escape it forever. Asterisk. Rachel's reaction was exactly as he'd hoped. When Daniel checked in, he shared that Rachel had shown the postcard to Evan, her hands shaking as she read it aloud. She thought it was a prank, perhaps a twisted joke from someone who had heard about Thomas's disappearance. But Evan seemed unfazed, dismissing her concerns as paranoia. Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before her unease deepened. The next week, he planted another breadcrumb. Using an old work ID he found before leaving Denver, he left a trace of himself at a gas station Rachel frequently visited. He knew she wouldn't be able to miss his distinct ID tag on the ground by the pump. Daniel confirmed later that she noticed it, her face going pale as she picked it up. Slowly but surely, the doubt began to grow in Rachel's mind. Thomas was carefully crafting his reappearance, piece by piece, letting them know he was still out there watching. Then came the financial hit. Thomas accessed their joint investment account online and made a small withdrawal, just enough to catch their attention, but not enough to set off any major alarms. He knew Rachel would receive an alert, and he imagined her frustration at seeing the funds siphoned out, as if Thomas were a ghost creeping back to claim what was his. As he expected, Daniel reported that Rachel had spent hours on the phone with the bank, demanding answers. But the bank couldn't trace it to Thomas, leaving her with nothing but a hollow assurance that they'd investigate. In her paranoia, Rachel even called the police, hinting at the possibility of Thomas lurking in the background, tampering with her finances. The authorities, however, saw no reason to take her concerns seriously without clear evidence. While she scrambled, Thomas continued to bide his time, using his isolation to strategize his final steps. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. Soon he'd need concrete proof of their plot, something that would make their crimes undeniable in the eyes of the law. So he dug deeper into Rachel and Evan's personal lives, determined to uncover any details he could use against them. The following week, Daniel managed to hack into Evan's emails. What he found only intensified Thomas' resolve. Evan was negotiating with a real estate agent, planning to buy a property under the name Thomas Grant. The address was linked to a lavish property in Miami, a place where Evan and Rachel could start fresh, using Thomas's stolen identity and finances to live the life they'd always wanted. When Daniel shared this information, Thomas felt a sick thrill of satisfaction. This was it. They weren't just covering up an affair. They were planning a full-scale identity theft, a scheme that would leave him penniless and possibly facing criminal charges if he ever tried to reclaim his life. But he still needed more, something irrefutable. And so, on a chilly Friday night, Thomas made a risky decision. He would break into their house and retrieve the evidence himself. He timed it perfectly. Both Rachel and Evan were out for the evening at an upscale restaurant, celebrating what they probably thought was their imminent victory. Clad in dark clothes and a hoodie, Thomas parked his rental car 2 blocks away and approached the house on foot. The familiar sight of his home filled him with a strange mix of nostalgia and anger. This place, once a symbol of his dreams, was now the stage for his revenge. He entered quietly through the back door, which he knew Rachel rarely locked. Once inside, he moved swiftly, checking her desk in the study, where she often kept sensitive documents. Sure enough, he found a folder labeled Estate Planning. Inside were papers he'd never seen before, documents detailing the transfer of his assets to a newly formed trust in Evan's name. Rachel had forged his signature on every page. Next, he went to the living room, where he knew they kept their personal laptops. After booting up Rachel's computer, he discovered a trove of emails between her and Evan, their words a sickening testament to their betrayal. They discussed everything from their Miami property plans to the exact timing for moving the funds. With each email he read, Thomas felt a cold rage building inside him. He took screenshots of every incriminating document, emailing them to himself through an encrypted account. By the time he finished, he had enough evidence to not only ruin their plan, but to implicate them in fraud, identity theft, and even conspiracy. This was everything he needed to take to the authorities. But as he was about to leave, he hesitated. He knew that he could simply walk away now and let the law deal with them, but it didn't feel like enough. He wanted them to know that they hadn't beaten him, that he'd seen through their lies and turned the tables. With a smirk, he picked up a pen and a piece of paper, scrawling a quick note. Asterisk, you thought you could outsmart me. Checkmate. Asterisk. Leaving the note on Rachel's desk, he slipped out the way he'd come, vanishing into the night. The next morning, Thomas put his final plan into action. He handed over every document and recording to his lawyer, who promised to work swiftly to ensure Rachel and Evan faced the consequences. He instructed his lawyer to alert the bank, the IRS, and the local authorities, who could investigate their fraudulent activity and trace the funds they tried to steal. But he didn't stop there. He also contacted Rachel's firm and submitted all the emails and documents as an anonymous whistleblower. Within hours, their fraudulent scheme was the subject of an internal investigation, and Rachel's professional reputation began to crumble. The day after the investigation went public, Daniel called with an update. Rachel is spiraling, Tom. She found the note. She thinks you're haunting her. Thomas laughed. Good, let her think that. I want her to feel the same fear she tried to put in me. Days passed, and news reached him that Rachel had been fired from her job. Her bank accounts were frozen, and an arrest warrant was issued for both her and Evan. The law had caught up with them, and their house of cards was collapsing. The irony wasn't lost on him that the life they'd so carefully crafted with his money and identity was now being dismantled. Finally, after months of hiding, Thomas was free. He returned to Denver, standing tall, no longer the naive man who had left. His experience had changed him, forging a strength he hadn't known he possessed. And as he looked forward to rebuilding his life, he felt a deep, satisfying sense of closure. Rachel and Evan had thought they destroyed him, but in the end, they'd only fueled his determination. He hadn't just survived their betrayal, he had won. With Rachel and Evan's scheme exposed, Thomas finally felt the weight of their betrayal lifting from his shoulders. But the real victory wasn't just in uncovering their lies, it was in watching them face justice. The authorities had moved quickly after receiving the evidence, and Rachel's firing from her job marked the beginning of the end for their carefully crafted plan. However, Thomas knew his role wasn't quite over. There was one last confrontation he needed to have, one last loose end to tie up. The police investigation had begun picking apart Rachel and Evan's financial records, and both were now under heavy scrutiny. With their assets frozen, they had lost access to the money they'd siphoned from Thomas's accounts, and an arrest warrant had been issued based on evidence of identity theft and fraud. Soon, they would face criminal charges that would likely ruin them for good. But Thomas wanted something more. He wanted to face Rachel, to see the look in her eyes as she realized the extent of her failure. He wanted her to know that he hadn't just disappeared into the night, that he was very much alive, and that her betrayal had been in vain. He reached out to Daniel and arranged one last meeting with her, a final showdown orchestrated on his terms. The next evening, he parked his car a few blocks away from Rachel's rented condo, where she had been staying since their accounts were seized and their home was seized as part of the investigation. She'd been under surveillance, but Daniel had managed to secure a few minutes alone for them. He walked quietly up the steps, his heart pounding in his chest. When he knocked on the door, he half expected her to turn him away. But to his surprise, Rachel opened it, her face a mixture of shock and fear as she took him in. "Thomas," she whispered, visibly shaken. She looked tired, her once proud posture diminished. "Surprised to see me?" he asked, his tone calm but steely. He stepped into the condo without waiting for an invitation. She took a shaky step back, folding her arms defensively. I thought you were gone." "I'm sure you did," he replied, his eyes cold. "But as you can see, I'm very much here, and I know everything." Rachel swallowed hard, her face pale. She seemed to realize there was no point in pretending, her mask of innocence falling away. "Thomas, Save it," he interrupted sharply. "I don't want to hear your excuses. You think you're the victim here. You plan to ruin my life, to take everything I'd worked for. You and Evan were ready to destroy me without a second thought." She looked down, unable to meet his gaze. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she muttered. "It just happened." Thomas let out a bitter laugh. "No, Rachel. This wasn't an accident. You and Evan planned every detail. You thought you'd get away with it, that I'd just vanish and leave you with everything. But you underestimated me." Rachel's face twisted with anger, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "You think you're so clever, Thomas? Do you know how it felt being married to someone who never saw me, who never gave me what I wanted?" "What you wanted was my money, Rachel," he shot back, "and you couldn't even be honest about that." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to argue. But then her shoulders slumped, defeated. "You have everything you need to ruin me. I know that. So why are you here?" "Because I want you to remember this," Thomas replied, his voice low but fierce. "I want you to remember that you lost. You thought you were smarter than me, that you'd outmaneuver me. But all you did was reveal who you really are, a liar, a thief, and a coward." Rachel's hands clenched at her sides, and for a brief moment, Thomas saw a flash of the woman he'd once loved. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by bitterness and resentment. "I hope it was worth it," he said, turning to leave, "because the only thing you'll have left now is regret." Without waiting for her response, he walked out, the sound of the door closing behind him like the final chapter in a long and painful story. In the days that followed, the wheels of justice turned swiftly. Rachel and Evan's arrest made headlines, their faces plastered across newspapers and news sites. They were charged with multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft, facing years in prison for their crimes. As their trial date approached, Thomas found himself free from the weight he carried for so long. He had won, but more importantly, he had reclaimed his life. With his finances and identity restored, Thomas took some time off to travel, to rediscover himself after the ordeal. He visited small towns and national parks, finding solace in the quiet beauty of the world. The solitude helped him heal, allowing him to leave behind the anger and betrayal that had defined his life for so long. One morning, while sitting at a small cafe in a coastal town, Thomas realized something important. He was no longer a victim of Rachel's betrayal. He was stronger, wiser, and ready to move forward. He'd lost a lot, but he had gained resilience, a determination to live fully and on his own terms. Months later, back in Denver, Thomas started a new chapter. He threw himself into his work, finding satisfaction in the projects he managed and the stability he built. The experience had left scars, but they were reminders of his strength, not his weakness. Then, on an ordinary Wednesday, he received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from Rachel, written from prison. Curious, he opened it, surprised to find a heartfelt apology. She spoke of regret, of the mistakes she'd made, and how she had finally realized the depth of her betrayal. But Thomas felt no anger, no hatred. Instead, he read the letter with a sense of closure, knowing that her remorse would be hers to bear, not his. As he set the letter aside, he knew that his life was finally his own again. The past was behind him, and a new horizon lay ahead. He was ready. After everything that had happened, Thomas wasn't sure what to expect next. The letter from Rachel sat on his desk, unopened for days. He had read enough of it to know what it contained: apologies, regrets, self-pity. But he wasn't interested in finding closure through her. What had happened between them and the consequences of her betrayal was behind him. Still, something in him felt like he owed it to himself to read it all the way through, to finish the story she had started. But he couldn't quite bring himself to open the letter. Instead, he kept it in the drawer of his desk, hidden away with other remnants of the past he no longer needed. And yet, he still couldn't ignore the sense of finality he felt after reading her words. She had finally realized what she had done, but it was too late for that kind of remorse. What mattered now was what he chose to do with his life moving forward. Thomas threw himself back into his work with a renewed sense of purpose. His career in construction was taking off again. He had earned a reputation as a reliable, skilled project manager, someone who could handle complex challenges and deliver on time. His days were filled with meetings, planning sessions, and overseeing projects, and as the months passed, the focus on work helped him put the past behind him. But deep down, he knew that something was missing. His life had been turned upside down, and despite the career successes, there was an emptiness in his heart. Rachel had been the love of his life, or so he thought. Now, with everything that had transpired, he realized that he couldn't just jump back into the kind of relationship he once had. Trust had been shattered, and the wounds left by her betrayal ran too deep to heal with a simple change of scenery. So, Thomas made a decision. He would no longer allow himself to live in the shadow of what had happened. He would no longer be the man who had been wronged, the man who had been taken advantage of. It was time to step into a new life, to rebuild not just his career, but himself. He took a few weeks off and traveled to places he had never been before. He visited small towns, mountains, and lakesides, searching for something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't about escaping. It was about finding peace, something that had eluded him for too long. He found solace in nature, in the quiet of the world outside of the chaos he had endured. And during these travels, Thomas began to realize something important. It wasn't the external world that needed to change. It was him. One evening, sitting on a bench overlooking a quiet lake, he had a breakthrough. The pain from his past was never going to disappear completely, but he could choose not to carry it with him any longer. He didn't need Rachel's apology or her regret to feel validated. He didn't need her at all. All he needed was to take control of his own destiny. As he made his way back to Denver, he felt lighter, more at peace. It wasn't that the past no longer mattered. It was that he was no longer letting it dictate his future. He had reclaimed his power, and he was ready for what was next. Back in Denver, life began to fall into place. Thomas continued his work, but he also started investing more in his personal life. He reconnected with old friends and made new ones. He took up hobbies he had neglected in the years before the turmoil: cycling, hiking, and even photography. He had once been so focused on building a career and a life with Rachel that he had forgotten about his own passions. Now he was learning to enjoy life on his own terms. Then, one day, while attending a work conference in downtown Denver, Thomas met someone. Her name was Clara, a fellow architect and project manager who was working on a major urban development project. They hit it off almost immediately, their conversations flowing effortlessly as they discussed their mutual passion for design and construction. There was an energy between them that he hadn't felt in years. Clara was kind, intelligent, and genuine, and for the first time since Rachel, Thomas felt that familiar spark of connection. He hesitated, of course, unsure whether he was ready for a relationship after everything that had happened. But Clara wasn't like Rachel. She didn't come with baggage or hidden agendas. She was refreshingly open and transparent, and Thomas couldn't help but be drawn to her. They spent the rest of the conference together, exploring the city, talking about their dreams, and sharing their life stories. By the end of the week, Thomas knew that Clara was someone he could see in his life. And though he was cautious, he allowed himself to be vulnerable for the first time in a long while. Over the next few months, their connection grew. They went on dates, worked on projects together, and supported each other through the ups and downs of their respective careers. Clara made him feel alive again, like he was worthy of love and happiness, despite the heartbreak of his past. Slowly but surely, Thomas opened himself up to the possibility of a future with her. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of her apartment, watching the sunset over the Denver skyline, Clara turned to him and smiled. "You know," she said softly, "I've never met anyone who has such a quiet strength about them. You've been through so much, and yet you carry yourself with such grace." Thomas looked at her, his heart full. He had been through the darkest moments of his life and had come out stronger on the other side. He had learned that strength wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about embracing it, learning from it, and letting it fuel you rather than hold you back. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It hasn't been easy, but I've learned that the only thing I can control is how I respond to life. And I choose to move forward, to live fully, to love, and to trust again." Clara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad we met." Thomas smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He was no longer the man who had been betrayed and broken. He was no longer defined by his past. He was someone new. Someone who had learned to rise from the ashes and embrace the possibility of a future filled with love, trust, and happiness. And as they sat together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Thomas finally felt at peace. He had overcome his darkest days and had emerged stronger, ready to face whatever came next. The past no longer had a hold on him. The future, with Clara by his side, was waiting to be written. In the months that followed, Thomas and Clara's relationship blossomed. They continued to support each other in both their professional and personal lives, each pushing the other to be their best selves. As the years went on, their partnership grew stronger, grounded in mutual respect, love, and shared dreams. They eventually decided to build a life together, purchasing a small house in the foothills just outside Denver, where they could escape the hustle and bustle of the city. Thomas never heard from Rachel again. Her life, ruined by her own choices, seemed to slip into obscurity, just as Thomas had hoped. He occasionally heard rumors of her time in prison, but it didn't matter anymore. She no longer had the power to hurt him. And though he had once loved her, he had long since let go of the anger and betrayal that had held him captive for so long. In the end, Thomas knew that his true victory wasn't in the justice he had served or the revenge he had taken. It was in the freedom he had gained, the freedom to live on his own terms, to build a new future, and to embrace the love that had once seemed impossible. And as he sat on his porch with Clara, watching the sunset and feeling the cool mountain air, Thomas knew he had found the peace he had been searching for all along.